our workday, VBS Prep Workday. If you have not done so, maybe after the service, just go around and take a look at everything that was accomplished. Amazing how much was accomplished in one day, so thank you. And also, one last note about next Sunday, leadership will discuss and make a decision on that, and we'll inform everyone within the next couple of days or so. Keep an eye out for an email or smoke signal. Ask somebody. Get informed. Nehemiah chapter 10. Go ahead and turn your Bibles there. We will cover the first 27 verses of Nehemiah chapter 10. It seems like a lot, but it's actually not that much considering the content. It's one of those chapters, one of those sections that we've done before where it's just a bunch of names. It's fun. But actually I get, and I think I've mentioned this before, I get kind of excited about these types of challenges. Obviously, if you superficially look at a chapter like this, you have a couple of options. You can just kind of read it and then just skip it and say, okay, nothing important there. Or you can invest a considerable amount of time and effort to try to see if there's something that can be gleaned and a principle that can be learned. And I kid you not, it's never failed. Every single time where I superficially see a section of the Bible that I have to teach, initially it seems pointless, meaningless, but again, after some time, there's something there. There's always something there. So I refuse to skip things over. Sometimes you have to utilize a little bit of imagination and a tiny little bit of speculation, which is not an issue. I had a professor in seminary school, and he used to just tell us, look, sometimes you just have to, look at a text in between the lines, but there is a difference between possibility and probability. Just because something is possible, it doesn't mean that it's probable. So lean towards probability. Even though you don't know exactly for sure, there are things that you can assume about a text that is worthwhile or worth mentioning. So this is more or less the exercise that we will partake in. So again, Nehemiah chapter 10, I will read from verses 1 to verse 27. Now those who placed their seal on the document were Nehemiah the governor, the son of Hekeliah, and Zedekiah, Soriah and Azariah, Jeremiah, Pashhur, Amariah, Melchijah, Hattush, Zebaniah, Malush, Harim, Miramoth, Obadiah, Daniel, Ginnethon, Baruch, Meshullam, Abijah, Maijamin, Mesa, Bilgai, and Shemaiah. These were the priests. Verse 9, the Levites, Jeshua, the son of Azaniah, Banua, of the sons of Henadad, and Kadmiel. Their brethren, Shebaniah, Hodijah, Kelida, Peliah, Hanan, Micah, Rehob, Hashabiah, Zakur, Sherebiah, Shebaniah, Hodijah, Bani, and Beninu, the leaders of the people, Parosh, Bahath, Moab, Elam, Zatu, Bani, Azgad, Bebai, Adonijah, Bigvai, Aden, Ader, Hezekiah, Azur, Hodijah, Hashum, Bazai, Harif, Anathoth, Nabai, Magpiash, Meshullam, Hazir, Meshezabel, Zadok, Jadua, Peladia, Hanan, Ananiah, Hoshea, Hananiah, Pashhur, Halohish, Pilha, Shobek, Hehrum, Hashabbanah, Masiah, Ahijah, Hanan, Anan, Maluk, Harim, Banan. So these were who signed the covenant. So backtracking a couple of weeks, we left off at a stage where the leadership who were representing the people, they decided to make a covenant with God. And all that covenant was, it had to do with their obedience. It wasn't really a covenant pertaining to a new agreement. It was basically them saying, look, that agreement that you made with our people a while back, now we are committing ourselves truly to obey, and now we're making that type of an addendum to the covenant that you made with us. We will obey your guidelines, your rules, your laws, your standards. And we don't just want to say it. We actually want to do something physical. And here you have a list of 84 people who essentially signed this document. Now, it wasn't literally a signature as we are accustomed to in this era. Instead of signing your name, you had a seal, sort of like a stamp, and you would press that upon some type of clay, and that meant that you were documenting something like this. So this is what was happening. Now, just to kind of dissect this list, again, here you have 84 names, but it is divided into subcategories of sorts. So in the first chapter, you have the name of the primary person that we've been talking about for the last couple of months. You have Nehemiah, followed by another name, which most likely is his private secretary, if you will. And then, after this first verse, you have sections where groupings of people are named. So from verse 2 to verse 8, you have the name of 21 priests. Following that, from verse 9 to verse 13, you have the name of 17 Levites. And I've mentioned this before, there is a difference between Levites and priests. Every priest was a Levite, but not every Levite was a priest. Okay? And that is followed by verse 14 to verse 27, where you have a list of names pertaining to civic leaders. All of these gave their signal. In other words, they signed this covenant. Now, Bob and Mike Harrison can vouch for this. A couple of weeks ago, when we were talking about what was happening in the future of Nehemiah, I mentioned, look at what is coming. Another list of a bunch of names. And the first thing that popped into my head, because it is within a context not only of a bunch of names, but it is a context of these individuals, more or less signing a document. The first thing, again, that popped into my head was John Hancock. Right? What is John Hancock? Somebody asks you for a John Hancock, what do you give them? Your signature. It became synonymous of that, but also there is a story behind that, and most of you, if not all of you, are familiar, right, with that story of the Declaration of Independence, where these leaders, these delegates from the original 13 colonies, they were meeting up, they were gathering to figure out what to do with England and that relationship. Eventually, they wanted to part ways and claim independence, so there was a need to draft a document, the Declaration of Independence, to officialize their intent to divorce, if you will, from England. And John Hancock was one of these people. He was actually one of the primary leaders in one of these gatherings of delegates. He presided over this meeting when they were drafting the Declaration of Independence, which is why you have a document that has his name, which eventually became synonymous with you signing a document. Now, you also know that the story kind of is additionally interesting because his name is a little bigger than everybody else's name, and there are a bunch of myths surrounding exactly why that is. The primary story is that he was so brave that he wanted King George to know who he was and read his name without spectacles, right? Most likely that is not true. Fact of the matter is, again, he was presiding over, one of these meetings, and so he was the primary person, likely that he was the first one to sign the document, and then everybody kind of saw the document and said, hey, 50 plus people, not enough room. So let's write our names, but a little smaller, or they were a little scared. Fact of the matter is, there wasn't that much room. Some people later on had to sign the document. They had to sign it on another page, right? Because there are so many people there. So that's kind of the story that popped into my head. And it makes sense that the first name that you see here is who? It's the person who's been presiding over this story. It's Nehemiah. So it's the first guy that you see, followed by his secretary. So this is our John Hancock, if you will. But then there are a bunch of other names that no one is familiar with, much less me. Some of these names we've seen before, some of these names we can speculate about, but the great majority of these, you have no idea. We have no idea who these people were. So this is where the investment comes in pertaining to try to adhere some type of principle or lesson from this section. Well, it turns out that the story that I mentioned about John Hancock and the Declaration of Independence, it goes on. And actually, the most interesting part of that story to me is the fact that some of these delegates, these 50-plus leaders of these original 13 colonies, some of them did not sign or wanted to sign the document for various reasons. Eventually, I think most of them did because there were a bunch of drafts of that document. But initially, some of them were reluctant to sign that document. So their names were absent initially from the Declaration of Independence. Now, think for a second here. You can even spend some time, I read it, mostly, butchered these names, but hopefully you were following along and paying attention, but you can even do so right now. Just look at the list, at least from verse 1 to verse 27. There's something missing here. There is someone missing here. Ezra. Remember what I mentioned about a month ago? It's odd that this book, the name of the book is Nehemiah, and he's been the primary character of this book for a while. But starting a couple of chapters ago, he no longer is the primary person. Now it's Ezra who is part of the story. Obviously, the book prior to this is named Ezra, but even then it's kind of a funny situation because he doesn't come in until the 7th chapter, right? He is a person he's one of these 3 primary individuals that God used in this era. Zerubbabel was the first one. He's the one that led these exiles back to the homeland, and his leadership was within the period where the temple was built. And then came Ezra, who was a scribe, a priest, and he was the one that organized the worship of God. Now that we have the temple, now we can go ahead and start doing our religious duties. And then, obviously, now we have Nehemiah, who finished the project by guiding or leading the people to rebuild the walls. So again, now Ezra comes back into the picture. The walls are finished, And he becomes the primary focus because now we're talking about religious things. Nehemiah was not a professional religious person. He was an organizer. He was a governor. The term that is used here for governor, it was actually utilized for Zerubbabel as well because both of them had similar offices. They were somewhat of politicians, if you will. But Ezra was a scribe. Ezra was a priest. And again, he has been leading the people in this effort now to rededicate themselves to God. And we, spent quite a bit of time talking about the prayer that most likely he is the one that constructed that. He's the one that made that prayer so that the people could follow along and dedicate themselves in a special way to God. But again, now that the prayer is over, which contained their history, and now that they are officially declaring that they will in fact obey, where's Ezra's name? Where did he go? Did he die? Could he have died? Well, he could not have died. Why is that a fact? If you fast forward to chapter 12, you will see, starting from verse 27, most likely you have a heading in your Bible there. It's when Nehemiah dedicates the wall. It was the inauguration, if you will, the celebration of that finished project. And then, if you go to verse 36, you will see somebody there. And his brethren, Shemaiah, Ezrael, Malai, Gilai, Mai, Nathaniel, Judah, and Hananiah, with the musical instruments of David, the men of God. And Ezra. Which Ezra is this? The scribe. Every time you see Ezra followed by the scribe, you know for sure it's this person that is being considered. This is a clue. A biblical clue that they're saying, look, there are other people named Ezra, but it's Ezra the scribe. So again, we know that he did not die. He did not perish. So he was still alive, yet his name is nowhere to be found. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that thought-provoking? Shouldn't we invest a little bit of time trying to figure out, if we can, why this is? Well, that's what I did this week. So, again, we have this list of names, and it's subdivided by priests, by Levites, by civic leaders. So let's just focus primarily on the segment that contains the priests. In other words, from verse 2 to verse 8. So there you have 21 names. Now, it is probable. Again, remember the difference between possibility and probability? It is probable that these names here are not names of individuals. It is likely that the names contained here from verse 2 to verse 8 primarily, but also this applies to the whole list to a degree, that these are family names. That these are names that categorize a grouping of people. Why is this a probability? Again, let's take a look at what is coming up next, going forward to chapter 12. I'm not going to spend too much time on chapter 12 because once we get to chapter 12, I won't have anything to say about chapter 12. But we do need to cover a little bit of what is contained here. So in chapter 12, it starts off this way. Now these are the priests and the Levites who came up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua. So here again, it's an account of their history. Zerubbabel being this original leader, about 100 years, prior to what we are covering here, the first wave of returning exiles, he's the one who was leading them. And now there is a list of people who came with him. And this list states that Sariah, Jeremiah, Ezra, do you see Ezra the scribe? No. This is not Ezra the scribe, because the scribe is not contained here. And again, this happened a long time ago. It would have been quite unlikely that this is the Ezra that we are discussing right now. Amariah, Maluk, Hattush, Shechaniah, so on and so forth. And then we get to verse 7, the second part of verse 7, which says, these were the heads of the priests and their brethren. Do you get what is happening here? These were the heads. These were the leaders of the priests. And then if you fast forward a little bit, this chapter actually contains two lists that kind of overlap. In other words, some names are repeated because it's placed here for different purposes, but all that you have to know is that it follows the same pattern. So if you look at verse 12, it says, now in the days of Joachim, the priest, the heads of the fathers' houses were. In other words, here, they did not want to name every single priest. So what do you do if you do not have the time, the space, the energy to name every single person within that category? You pick the head of that clan. You pick the leader, whether if it's a current leader or somebody from their past that will symbolize that group. So something similar is happening. So this, for sure, this is what is happening. And I believe that it is probable that something similar was happening in this list of names in Nehemiah chapter 10. These are not names of individuals. These are names of groupings of people that are categorized or being symbolized by one individual's name. Another reason why I think this is a strong possibility or a probability is that this was a standard. So if you now turn back to 1 Chronicles. So 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles chapter 24. You will see something that David did when he started reigning as a king. He basically organized all of the people. So if you just flip through some of these chapters, chapter 24 of 1 Chronicles, I have a heading here saying the division of the priests. The following heading is other Levites, the musicians. Chapter 26, the gatekeepers, the treasuries and other duties, the military divisions, chapter 27. So again, David, he was dividing up these offices, if you will, the people that were part of these positions. So pertaining to chapter 24 and the priests, what David did was he divided up the priesthood into 24 families. He took Aaron's lineage, and Aaron's lineage is important within the priesthood. I think I've mentioned this before. Levites, special people, because those were the people that God took for his service. Within the Levites, you have some even more special people who are the priests. And within that group, you have even a more select group who are the Aaronite priests. Those were usually the ones that could become a high priest, but they were higher ranking than other priests. So here what David did in 1 Chronicles chapter 24 is that he organized the priesthood. He divided them up into 24 families, the sons of Aaron, more or less, so that again, this was all organized and orderly because he was establishing this kingdom. So again, this is a norm. This is a standard, and it makes perfect sense for them to maintain this because what are they doing now? They are reestablishing their culture. They are reestablishing their ways of life. They are going back to their homeland, and they want to continue as things were before. So now they are grouping people together. They are dividing people up, not naming every single person, but just the heads of these households or heads of clans. Additionally, now going back to Ezra. So, not Nehemiah, but Ezra. On chapter 7, you will find important information there. On chapter 7 of Ezra, verse 1, you will see specifically Ezra's pedigree. Again, in the book of Ezra, Ezra only comes in the 7th chapter. And when he is officially introduced, he is introduced as the son of whom? Sariah. Does that sound familiar? It should sound familiar. Why should that name sound familiar? Because it's a name, it's literally the third name that we see in Nehemiah chapter 10. Sariah. Who was Sariah? Sariah was the father of Ezra. So Ezra indirectly is included in this list. Not by name, but because his father's name was there, that included that whole family, which he was a part of. Now, quite possibly, probably, we've solved the mystery. We know that Ezra was not running away from his obligations. We know that he did not forget to press down his seal and make this commitment. Most likely, he was included here because they chose this name to symbolize the family that Ezra was originally from. And by the way, this was a very important individual. Lineage right straight to Aaron. Ezra was part of this elite group of Levites. He was an Aaronite. He was both a scribe and a priest. Now, why is all this important? Why do we need to spend so much time talking about this? First of all, just to educate ourselves a little bit about, the minutia of the Bible. But also this touches upon a very important principle that we should all be concerned with, that we should all be partaking in. This touches upon the idea of legacies. What is a legacy? A legacy is something, simply put, that is passed down to others, right? This ancestry. And Ezra, he had an awesome legacy. Again, he was part of this very elite group of Levites. He was within this family that could be traced all the way to Aaron, but again, very specific because he could have even been a high priest. What a legacy. And we know that his father was a person who was very significant. He was part of this group that originally came along with Zerubbabel. He was someone who was important, even though we don't have stories about him details, if you will. He was significant enough to be named several times in the Bible. An important individual. And then here you go on and you finally have Ezra, who was no slouch either. Legacy. And there are two things that we always need to be concerned pertaining to legacy. Because you either should be a legacy keeper or a legacy maker. Again, let me repeat that. Two things that we need to be concerned about legacies. You, me, all of us, we either need to be legacy makers or legacy keepers. What is a legacy keeper? It's someone that appreciates what has occurred in the past. His forefathers or her forefathers, if you will. Literally speaking, parents, grandparents, or just kind of their lineage. They appreciate it so much that they understand that the things that were passed down, most importantly, are spiritual legacy. These truths that we hold dear. We want to keep these. We want to treasure these. We want to even build upon these because we've been blessed to have them since we were very little. And now we can again incorporate that into our lives and pass it on. Legacy keepers. But some people, they're not fortunate enough to have that. They look at their past and they see no legacy worth keeping. Do they just give up? Should they just not care about legacy? No. If you cannot keep a legacy, what should you do? You need to be a legacy maker. Maybe you cannot look into your past and glean these treasures, but then you have to look forward. Because there are those that are coming after you. And again, if you cannot hold on to a legacy, you better make one. Do not just experience life in the present in this sense. Look forward to what you can leave behind to those who are coming after you so that they can keep these constructed legacies and build upon them and move forward. This list is a story of legacy. It's a story of legacy makers and a story of legacy keepers. Nehemiah, for example, most likely he was a legacy maker. He did not come from pedigree. He was not a professional religious person. He was a cupbearer, which was a high-ranking official, but not too important in the grand scheme of things. Did he just say, I'm not a priest, I'm not a Levite, I'm not an Aaronite? No. There's something that must be done. And I'm looking around, and no one is doing it. So I'm going to do it. And because of that, he made a legacy. Do you think that it was important for the generations after Nehemiah that were somehow related to him to name drop? I'm from the clan of Nehemiah. He was a pretty important dude. He left this legacy not because he inherited, he made it. And now he's passed the baton, and I'm going to run with this. What can we not do? We cannot and we should not be legacy breakers or legacy avoiders. That is the opposite. That is literally the opposite. Legacy breakers are people who have something. It's been passed down. They have been fortunate enough to have people that came before them that passed something down, but instead of treasuring that, instead of utilizing that, instead of building upon that and moving forward, what do? They break it. And now, those who come afterwards, they have no legacy. It's broken. It's seized. There's nothing left. We cannot be legacy breakers. Believe it or not, people have worked very hard to pass these things down to you and I. And we must take advantage, treasure them, and pass them down. Or legacy avoiders. Who are those people? They're the people that have the excuse, look, I don't have anything. I don't come from great spiritual pedigree. I've kind of figured things out on my own. And I'm still trying to figure these things out. So I don't have anything to pass down. No, you're avoiding your obligation. Because if you don't have anything that was passed down, you better make sure that you're making some legacy so that those who come after you can utilize that and move forward with that which you left behind. Long story short, be legacy keepers and legacy makers. And maybe, just maybe, you will be included in one of these lists as the head of the household. Amen.